So thanks to ARM for the invitation to host this session, and also for these incredible cell and gene state of the industry briefings, which continue to show real progress for the space. As you can tell from the title, we're really here to discuss the seminal moment that's arrived for gene therapy and sickle cell disease, and of course to discuss what's next. So for introductions, I'm Gbola Amusa, as mentioned, partner and chief scientific officer of Chardan, which is a global boutique bank focused on disruptively innovative companies that create real value for society. So I'll pass it to Sam next to introduce himself.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's always great to be part of ARM. Sam Kulkarni, I'm the CEO of CRISPR. I'm a scientist by training. Spent the last 15 years or so in biopharma and joined CRISPR in 2015. Our goal always was to create the next Genentech, maybe even beyond that. And we've taken steps towards that. We have a pretty big portfolio, but obviously the big highlight was the approval of Casgevy for sickle cell disease in December.
Hi everyone. I'm Andrew Obenshain. I am the CEO of Bluebird. I've been there for 7 years now. Bluebird's been around for longer than that, for over a decade now. I think originally known for scientific and clinical innovation in gene therapy. Then recently we've just gotten our third approval with Lyfgenia for sickle cell disease, and very excited to be bringing all three of our gene therapies to patients now commercially, and now innovating on the commercial side as well as the clinical and the science side, and hopefully paving the way for a number of people in the audience as well for future gene therapies.
Great. Thank you both, and congrats to Sam for the first CRISPR-based gene therapy being FDA approved and starting the commercial era for gene editing, and also to Andrew for their third FDA approval. So I wanted to start by first orienting the audience a bit to what each of their companies do. So would you each perhaps provide a quick introduction and overview for the state of the respective spaces you're in? So what went well in 2023, what didn't, what are the implications of the approvals you got, and what are you looking forward to in 2024? So I'll start with Sam on that one.
Yeah, thank you, Gbola. I think this audience already is quite familiar with CRISPR and the gene editing technologies. It was sort of a landmark year for gene editing, obviously with the approval, the first approval about 10 years after the seminal publication from Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier. That is a rapid pace of translation that has not been seen with new modalities before. Maybe in the early protein antibody days, we had the first approval, but then it did take some time, and typically it's taken about 15 years or so for a modality, take an example of siRNA, to go from start to first approval. So that obviously was a major watershed moment for gene editing. But what's also very encouraging is the science is moving at a very rapid pace. There's new forms of editing, there's new disease models. You're showing that editing can work in not just a handful of diseases, but tens and maybe even hundreds of diseases where this can be applicable. So that, and I should acknowledge that we're standing on the shoulders of many companies that came before and the shoulders of giants. Take the work that Bluebird's has done in terms of cell and gene therapies, what Alnylam's done in terms of delivery, and many other companies, and all that's converging to make this a rapid pace of innovation. So on the one hand, we live in a golden era for cell and gene therapies, particularly gene editing, because it's all converging very rapidly, and there is investment in the space, and a lot of academics are working on it. The best minds are working on it. Now, the second part of it, which is the rest of my 3 days at JP Morgan, is talking to investors, which is, how is this all going to evolve? And, what is the equation in terms of the capital in versus capital out? What is it going to take to make these approvals come faster, make them more efficient, and how is the industry going to mature? And those are all open questions, but that's why this year is really important, 2024, as we look forward to it, because we're going from that sort of immature cottage industry in a way for cell and gene therapies to something more mature. And I think the first approval obviously gives you tailwinds, but all the science that's going behind it and all the investments will give you additional ammo to essentially make this a big part of the pharma industry versus what it is now, which is a upcoming and fast-growing niche to something that's more mainstream.
Andrew?
I'm actually going to pick up on that last point because I think 2023 really for Bluebird was about that. It was innovating on the business side in addition to the clinical and the research side. So, Bluebird's been through a number of evolution in its history. I just remind people when we treated our first sickle cell patient, it worked beautifully. We treated our second and the third, it didn't. We had to alter the manufacturing process. We had to alter some clinical parameters as well. We had to really learn, right? And that was the crux of the Bluebird's identity at the time, that research and that clinical expertise. We still have. But 2023, we were launching 2 gene therapy products. And they're, unfortunately, for a biotech company, usually phase 3 data, you get your phase 3 data, everyone's like, oh, great, it works, it's gonna be great. But these therapies are delivered very, very differently than other therapeutics. They're manufactured very, very differently. And 2023 was about showing, proving to ourselves and proving to the world that we can actually go out there and set up treatment centers, that we can go out there and get reimbursement for a product that has a value of millions of dollars, that we can actually bring these in reality to patients and make them a commercial success for ourselves, but I think more importantly in this ARM audience, right, for all those people coming behind, all that innovation that's going on to make sure that there's actually a commercial path forward to bring these therapies to patients. So that was the 2023 for Bluebird.
Great. So obviously regulatory is a big component of what happens in cell and gene, and I want to bring Dr. Marks into this panel a little bit by quoting him. In April of last year, he said, if all we manage to do every year in the next few years is approve another 2 or 3 gene therapies, that's a failure. Success would be that we start to watch what should be, if not exponential, at least some logarithmic progression here towards more and more gene therapies being approved. So, unquote. If there's that kind of expansion, obviously global regulators have to be ready. So I'm just curious what your wish list is for how regulators globally can prudently support gene therapy companies. So I'll start with Andrew on that one.
Yeah, thank you. So I think Dr. Marks alluded to some of this as well, especially, so many of the gene therapies are going out after very small patient populations. Harmony across regulators would be fantastic. I think that is, don't hold your breath, right? That's going to take a while. But I do think that there's needs to be some recognition that these are very, very expensive therapies to produce, and when you're producing for small populations, if you're producing one batch and you have to throw that out because of you didn't meet a spec, there's some assays that didn't perform right, et cetera, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars for a small company. And I think there needs to be some flexibility around chemistry manufacturing controls, CMC, which is we're doing biological processes as an industry right now. And I think they're continuing to evolve with the regulatory agencies about what that looks like so that the regulatory path can be a little bit more streamlined, especially on the CMC side, would be very beneficial to small companies.
Sam?
Yeah, before I say anything, I just want to acknowledge Dr. Marks's role in all this, and single-handedly, the impact you've had on cell and gene therapies and helping companies is immeasurable. So thank you, Dr. Marks. The central question, I guess, to answer the regulatory question is, how can we make these therapies more efficiently, right? Right now, if you look at what it's cost, I'll say for Bluebird, for CRISPR to get a sickle cell therapy approved, is well over $1 billion. And people do funny math. People say, well, this will cost you, when you do investor presentations, it's going to cost you $100 million to develop this drug to approval. It's not true, because you have to count all the costs of having a company there, all the manufacturing costs, the setup of a manufacturing facility. And when you put all that together, it's really expensive compared to an antibody or a small molecule that you're putting through to the clinic. And so if that's the central question, is how can we get these medicines that are life-changing for patients in a more efficient way? One of the aspects of that is the regulatory requirements. And as Dr. Marks was saying, that what's happened in many cases is you're taking academic innovation where you're manufacturing, let's say at Moffitt or some other place, and then translating that into a company or bringing that into what's quote-unquote a pivotal trial or an approvable trial. And it's just not the same, because those were done in academic settings, and when you put the requirements of a pivotal manufacturing facility, you're going to incur a lot of delays to do the comparability and the transitions. and incur a lot of costs. And so that's the central problem, is how do you overcome that challenge of translation from academic settings into an industry setting? Or you start with a clean slate like we did with Exocell, and said, let's just start with the commercial manufacturing process right from the get-go. Now, all that said, as we mature, do we need all these potency assays? Do we need all the follow-up for 15 years? All those things add up for costs, and perhaps as we show more data and build a greater body of data around different vectors, different guides, different enzymes, that you may not need all those assays, you may not need all the characterization, and that would make it more efficient. So 2 points. One is obviously the harmonization between the US and ex-US. The second is, what are all the CMC requirements that are necessary, truly necessary, to translate these medicines to patients? And I'll also say it's not just regulatory. The companies have to take responsibility. One of the things we did with our allogeneic CAR Ts against CD19, our first generation allogeneic CAR T was called CTX110, and now we have a next generation allogeneic CAR T called CTX112. And as biotech companies, we're all geared towards innovation, but our innovation is about, what's the next edit, or what's the next sort of change you want to make in the cells, not about manufacturing. And that's because, that's not been part of the DNA of biotech companies to say we're going to do careful process characterization to improve yields, or we're going to improve this device to make this process better. And for instance, our cost of goods on our CTX110 program, our CD19 program, was well north of $60,000 per patient. Okay, because it may not be on a per batch basis if you calculate the variable cost, but if you put all the costs together and amortize it, it was well north of that, which is more than autologous therapies. So then we got our company to say, how do we put all our energy behind making these COGS lower? And our next generation program now has a cost of goods of $13,000. And I think as companies, we also have to take responsibility to do that work that seems sometimes boring, which is all the process characterization, all the improvements in the tech ops side. And I keep telling our tech ops team at our company that they are very important in the scheme of the company. It used to be in biotech that the medical side was the key. They were the ones coming up with the idea of how to treat a patient, and that was the key to innovation and getting new assets approved. But tech ops and manufacturing have become extremely important to make this business model work. And I think the responsibility is not just on the regulatory front, but also on the company side to make this a little more streamlined and efficient.
Got it. So next question is really just an open one to you both. You've obviously had a lot of conversations in the past month with stakeholders, including investors, patients, et cetera. What's misunderstood? What's overlooked? What's underappreciated about the approvals, if anything?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll start with that one. I think there's a lot of perceptions versus reality. Actually, the first one I find probably the most misunderstood is the perception that sickle cell patients are not going to come forward, which is totally false. I think we heard, there was 2 patients that were up on the screen earlier. It's a transformative therapy for them. There haven't been a lot of good therapeutic options for this patient population, and now there are. So I think there's an investor perception that maybe the willingness of the sickle cell community to come forward versus the beta thalassemia community is different. That's not true at all. I think that we'll see that when we actually have a solution for the patients, that the patients will be there. The second misperception I think that is out there, and I think this goes back to I want to go do a history lesson, but is the value of gene therapy, right? There's these therapies that bring a tremendous amount of value to the healthcare system, to the patients, and that they're not going to be paid for. But what we've seen with cell and gene therapies so far, all the cell and gene therapies that are up on that screen, they're all being paid for by payers. And why is that? It's because the economic value and the patient value is there. If you actually you can publish data that shows, I think for one of the first times in the history of biotech and pharma, you can do these pharmacoeconomic models that actually show the value. You can go to payers and talk about that, right? And talk about when you pair that with, hey, you only have to pay these if the full value of the therapy is recognized. That really makes a difference, and they're covered. I go back in history to Genzyme, right, which made, when they first launched 30 years ago with Ceridase and then Cerezyme, They was a very rare population. They were very, they had a big price tag on the therapies, but they brought a lot of value to that pediatric populations that they were treating at the time, those rare populations. And they were covered as well, but it took a little while for the whole industry to appreciate that this rare disease business model could work. Now, today, fast forward to gene therapy, it's it's 30 years later, slightly different. The reason that these therapies are being covered is because the value is there. The pharmacoeconomic value, to use a very old term, right, is there for these therapies. So I think that's the second misperception that we've seen. But overall, I'd have to say I think the investors are starting to come around, right? I think it was a really rough year for the last couple of years, right? But I think that starting to come around with these launches to seeing the value of these therapies.
And I'll add, so that's definitely one, which is currently the general sentiment among investors is that these launches are not going to be successful or they're going to be very slow. And I think that they're getting it wrong. I think if you look at the ecosystem, you go to the ICER meeting or you go to the payer meetings, you go to the Aspen Institute, they're all very excited about these sickle cell medicines. They want to pay for it. They want to bring it to their constituents. They actually, in fact, want to advertise it to their customers, who are the employers, and say, look, we're covering these advanced medicines. So I've actually been surprised that there's more skepticism within the inner circle of biopharma than the broader ecosystem. There's people calling it the biggest innovations for humanity. In fact, there was a podcast in the Bay Area of all the tech innovations. This is one of the biggest ones because, you think about AI and singularity, which is the point at which machines become smarter than humans. The same vein, humans figuring out how to edit their own genes to fix themselves is sort of like singularity. It's a big moment, and we're not celebrating enough. In fact, there's skepticism in the most inner circles of biopharma, but the broader ecosystem, I think, will support it, and these launches will be more successful. The second big perception out there, which I'm getting a lot of questions on, is when is pharma going to fully dive in? Okay, what you had is sort of mid-sized companies like Vertex, Regeneron, Bayer, Astellas jump in and say we're going to embrace cell and gene therapies, and Novartis obviously, but still big pharma, quote unquote, has not made investments to the level which would indicate that they are really behind cell and gene therapies, and they believe that a third of the market will be cell and gene therapies in the next 15 years. And until that happens to a little more greater extent, people will be not skeptical, they'll just be in wait and watch mode. And I do think I sense that happening now in big pharma. We're having a lot of conversations. Everyone's saying we have to play in this space. We can't afford not to play in cell and gene therapies. And when that happens, everything's going to come together. Things will accelerate very quickly because pharma investment, as you know, is almost 3x that of all of biotech investments on a dollar for dollar basis. And so we're going to see many more medicines developed if pharma fully jumps into the mix.
Great. I want to move to the planned commercial rollouts, the ongoing and planned. Obviously, it's very early days, but we want to talk about a community sickle cell disease that's a little bit overlooked and underfunded historically. So what are your plans to ensure accessibility, to make sure that patients and caregivers are knowledgeable, that payers are actually engaged in reimbursing these products, and that the big opportunity that exists does play out? We'll start with Andrew on that.
Yeah, great. So I think there's, first of all, we have to appreciate that 50% of sickle cell patients are covered by Medicaid. 10% are dual eligible, Medicaid, Medicare, the rest are commercial. So making, accessibility is an incredibly important issue for Bluebird. And we have put together outcomes-based agreements that are specific for Medicaid for this reason. I'm going to go back to my point for all the other cell and gene therapies. If you look what's happened so far, Medicaid patients are getting access. For Zynteglo and for Skysona, our first two launches, we've had 0 ultimate denials, and that's true of Medicaid in addition to the commercial patients. So I think there is a perception that Medicaid won't pay, but in fact, Medicaid actually recognizes this value and is paying. So we've been in discussions now for over 18 months with different Medicaid agencies. For Zynteglo, there are 17 different coverage policies. 3 of them have outcomes-based agreements. We do anticipate the same for our sickle cell therapy as well. But the accessibility in the U.S., I think, is something that can be addressed, and that will be addressed, and there will be equitable access across the government payers and across the commercial payers. I think globally, it's going to be a little bit of a different story. I think these are still first generation technologies. I think you'd probably need second and third and fourth generation technologies to get outside of the industrialized world, right? These are not the right therapies for that, and that's really the big problem, I think, to solve next, is how do we do the next generation of technologies that can be get access more globally versus just the industrialized nations.
So Andrew, just a quick follow-up. Blue managed to get the coverage range in the US to 200 million within a month of the FDA approval. And you also have qualified treatment centers, dozens of them. So first of all, how did you do the coverage range success? And what do those qualified treatment centers mean?
Yeah, so actually, I think, so it comes back to the fact that these are therapies that provide a lot of benefit to patients. And we've been talking to these commercial payers for quite a while, and these Medicaid payers for quite a while. So this was not an overnight success, right? You saw 200 million lives covered because of long ongoing conversations and just a recognition of the value. And a recognition of the value that also paired with an outcomes-based agreement where the payer is only putting it forward if the therapy works. And these payers I think they have, we think of payers as monolithic bureaucrats doing counting beans, but that's not what they are. They want to provide therapies for their patients. They want to be able to say to their employers that they cover the most innovative therapies. They want to be able to say to their employers that they get the best deal for their employers and that they're only going to pay for things that work, but they want to provide care for the employers that they cover. And that's why I think you're seeing this coverage, because these therapies do that. They bring real value to the patients. And they bring real both economic value and patient value. And so these were not overnight conversations. It was a long time. Same with the QTCs, the Qualified Treatment Centers. These are, you cannot distribute these therapies through a wholesaler. They have to be distributed through a transplant center, and that transplant center has to become part of your supply chain. So they need to be talking to your IT people. They need to be talking to your quality systems. They need to be, you're talking to your lawyers to sign to MSA. The customer-facing aspect of a gene and cell therapy company is much, much more than just MSLs and sales reps. It's a very broad group. And so having those groups out for Zynteglo and for Skysona, really establishing those relationships with the transplant centers early meant that we now have, I think, 48 centers set up for Zynteglo. 35 of those are ready to take on patients for Lyfgenia, for our sickle cell therapy. And that's because, once you do all the hard work to set them up, it's just a matter of adding a product to the product schedule for the next one. So that's how we were able to do it. But again, I would say, just to say, most of these transplant centers, 80% of them at least, and probably more, want to have both therapies, right? They want to have all the different options they can for their patients. They want to actually be able to provide these for their patients. So I think it's, like the clinicians, like the payers, absolutely see the value for their patients.
And Sam, your press release, before talking about access for CRISPR, I think your December 8th press release mentioned 16,000 eligible patients in the US, and obviously wholesale acquisition cost is $2 million. So that's tens of billions of dollars of opportunity there. But in the context of, again, a more expensive medicine, how do you ensure access, patient knowledge, et cetera?
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of the points that Andrew made. I was at a think tank type of event not too long ago, and there were some of the payer CEOs there, and I'll tell you privately what one of the payer CEOs was telling me, which is they're way more worried about GLP-1 and how they're going to pay for $100 billion worth of category versus cell and gene therapies or rare diseases. They almost, they're like, we want to market the fact that we pay for cell and gene therapies to our employers and say how sophisticated we are. It's just that it's not easy to do outcomes-based contracting, or it's not easy to track patients. And in many ways, they just said, we just want to pay for it because it's more hassle for us to track some of these things. We already see the data. These data are great. they're worried about different things. They're worried about some of the hospital costs going up, keep going up, and how to keep up with that inflation, labor shortages, et cetera. So this is us all worried about how payers are going to cover for things. I do think in the next 2-3 years you're going to see that there will be coverage across the board in the U.S. There will be coverage in Europe as well, because European systems, obviously they have even more complex systems to get something on coverage because of their budget issues. It just takes them longer, but there is support, at a fundamental level. And from an epidemiology perspective, yes, the opportunity size is large, but these are not launch trajectories where, like HCV, you're depleting the bolus in 1 or 2 years, where all of a sudden there's a big budget issue for the payers. These are going to be, somewhat slow and measured launches that keep growing for a long time. So I don't see fundamental roadblocks or fundamental issues as we look at these launches going forward.
Got it. And obviously you have a collaboration with Vertex. So why did that make sense years ago, and why does it make sense now? What are the benefits?
Yeah, I would say, when I was at McKinsey, I had a view into many different partnerships from the big pharma side. And I would say 75, three-quarters of the partnerships all had a lot of issues. There were always the issues of this cultural match between a small company that wants to move fast and a big company that wants to do everything with their own processes and own systems to make it more robust. And with Vertex, I would say we've had a great partnership. And one of the reasons is we've had alignment at the top, right? From when Jeff was the CEO, and now Reshma with CRISPR, to say that we want to bring these therapies to patients fast in a very expeditious fashion, but at the same time in a very robust fashion. And for us, early days, we kind of knew how much it's going to cost to develop this medicine. For us as a company by ourselves to finance all that was going to be difficult. The second part of this is, we wanted to bring this globally, and to build a European infrastructure costs a lot of money for a biotech company, or to build an ex-US infrastructure. So Vertex had all that. But most importantly, because we had the combined balance sheets and the capital early on, we could develop a CMC process that was much more developed in the early stages than what typically you do with cell and gene therapies. You're trying to just get the first few patients worth of data with something that's an academic process. And we said, let's just start with the commercial process from the get-go. And that allowed us to move much faster, I think, than many other companies that were trying to go after the same sort of edits or the same disease state. And it's been a very fruitful partnership, and now I think Vertex is probably the best company to commercialize a drug globally. And I can see that having an established infrastructure makes a lot of difference versus trying to build it all as you're going forward and launching a drug. So obviously I want the sector to do well. I want all the companies playing in the space to do well. But I think, as I see what Vertex is doing in terms of global launch, I'm very encouraged.
So it's super early days, but I'm still going to ask the unfair question. Any early signals on patient uptake, or do you have any expectations for the future? So Sam, and then back to Andrew.
No, this is not the forum to talk about, uptake numbers or what that looks like. But, I just, in a big picture of things, I am very encouraged for cell and gene therapies. I think these investor cycles and capital cycles, they always go through cycles. There's a reason for that, from all the reasons from interest rates being high to pharma not jumping in because of FTC action to whatever else that may be happening. And there's flavors of the day. People go from cell type to different cell types and all that. But fundamentally, the level of progress we're showing is so great in terms of scientific improvement, whether it's making more sophisticated cells, whether it's accessing more complex editing, more complex engineering, whether it's regenerative medicine. When I just came from a meeting where they're able to perfuse a kidney to be transplanted for about a week and make edits in those kidneys, which was never possible before. It's things like that we're doing that we were not doing 10 years ago. And because of that, I'm very encouraged. And I do think the ecosystem will recognize that potential, and patients will recognize that potential, providers will recognize that potential, and I think we'll find the commercial path. That is not the challenge. The challenge is, how do you find these concepts and develop them more efficiently in a compressed timeline versus what we have right now? And I'm very confident and positive for the future.
Yeah.
Andrew?
So I likewise probably won't fully scratch the itch on patient uptake, but I will say, so we do anticipate that we will collect our first patient in the first quarter this year. I think that you will see hospitals adopting these therapies much more quickly than investors think they will. I think the echo chamber we were talking about is really with investors around the skepticism. It's not with clinicians. It's not with patients. So I think for both these therapies, I do hope that the next time we're hearing from patients about their stories, it was patients that were treated in the commercial setting, that we can actually make this a reality.
Great. Andrew, you mentioned earlier the outcomes-based contracting that you have with payers. Can you flesh out a little bit more why that made sense for you and whether it could impact your cash flows in the future?
So let me actually say something that didn't make sense first, was actually when we were talking about Europe. When Bluebird first came, we said, there's two things we think the payers are going to want. They want to be paid over time, and they're going to want outcomes-based agreements, right? They're only going to want to pay if it works. Well, we were dead wrong on the first. Both in Europe and in the US, payers told us it's way too complicated to follow patients over time, right, to pay over time. Sorry, it's not complicated to pay over time, follow them, it's complicated to pay over time. So we don't want that. But they said, we really like the idea of an outcomes-based agreement, but it has to be something that we can measure very, very easily. So in the case of beta thalassemia, it was transfusion independent. It's very clear whether a patient gets a transfusion or not. It's very black and white, so that was very easy to measure. In the case of sickle cell disease, it's very easy to measure hospitalizations for severe VOEs. These are payers. They get the claims data. So it had to be something that was super clear and super easy to measure. And if that was the case, right, then they could easily track it without a lot of administrative burden, and then turn around to their employers and say, listen, here are these wonderful therapies. They have tremendous benefit, but we negotiated a contract that we're only going to pay if it works for your employee. We're not going to pay. You're not going to pay if it doesn't. And I think that was really the crux of it, that you had to have something very simple that you can measure and very easy to see.
Sam, I think CRISPR is expecting a U.S. approval in March for transfusion-dependent beta thal. And so what are the implications from the SCD approval to beta thal? How does that affect the path forward for TDT?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very similar approach and a similar product. And effectively, you're making an edit to the BCL11A enhancer that elevates the level of fetal hemoglobin. And that same mechanism applies for both sickle cell disease to overcome the defectiveness of the beta globin gene, and in thalassemia to overcome the deficiency of the beta globin gene. So the scientific premise is the same, and the clinical data are very strong for thalassemia as well, where we treated over 50 patients in our initial trial. And I think we're going through the regulatory process there, and I think globally as well, I think there are a number of thalassemia patients in Europe. And in fact, I did a recent trip to Asia, and the unmet need for thalassemia in Asia is tremendous. There are entire clinics dedicated to thalassemia patients in Thailand, and one of the investigators there was like, well, we need a solution desperately. I think, and that's one of the things that we all have to think about as an alliance of people practicing cell and gene therapies of regenerative medicine, is how do we eventually get these medicines not just to the US and Europe, but also beyond that, which may involve in vivo delivery to HSCs, which may involve a different way of manufacturing these cell therapies that don't have all the costs associated with it like we do now. And we kind of owe it to these patients. And so I do think that thalassemia in the US is a smaller burden, but ex-US is a very large burden, especially as you look at some of the Asian countries. And then sickle cell as well, I think we've been surprised by the level of interest from the Middle East. The burden of sickle cell in countries like Saudi and Bahrain and others is tremendous as well. So we do need to get these medicines to population outside of just the US and Europe that we sometimes tend to think about in the early days.
Got it. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the biotech winner, the so-called biotech winner, which has been the worst financing environment for biotech in the 2000s. That's what the data show. What's your advice and lessons learned to cell and gene companies in terms of how to better position themselves to the extent another unexpected shock emerges, to the extent the markets do get better, that is?
Well, I think Bluebird's felt the biotech winter quite a bit, I know, along with other companies as well. In a cell and gene therapy, I think Sam was alluding to this as well. I think one of the things you have to recognize is that cell and gene therapies are essentially manufacturing companies, right? Unlike other therapeutic companies, the tech ops, the quality teams, the capacity that you're building, you're a manufacturing company whether you know it or not. And so in these moments, you really have to protect that and really invest in your manufacturing capabilities and capacity and expertise. And not in the traditional areas necessarily where you would have in a biotech company or a pharma company. You have to prioritize that first in addition to your clinical and research teams. And then everything else really has to take a back seat to that as you go forward. You really have to be very, very clear about what your identity is as a company in order to appropriately allocate the resources, which is, I think all of us have probably, many people in this room have grown up in a traditional pharma or a traditional biotech where it's very easy to pull out the playbook that you've done before and flip through the pages on medical affairs or on commercial or in G&A or something and start to build that. But my advice to these companies right now would be stop, flip to the tech ops and quality page, flip to the research and clinical page, prioritize that, your first dollars there and not to the other areas in order to survive an environment like this.
Sam?
Yeah, I want to put the biotech winter in context. It is a biotech winter compared to 2021, where capital was very easily available and it was easy to write a PowerPoint deck and go public as a company, right? But if you compare it to 10 years ago, the level of funding in cell and gene therapies is still 8x what we had in 2012. Okay, so it's not a biotech winter from that perspective. It's still a secular growth market with capital. What's changed is there's more capital in the private side versus the public side. It's the public investors that have been disenchanted because they generally play for, we're going to invest in a company and pharma's going to buy it and we're going to make a big return. That's not happening, right? So it's really but it's the most visible aspect. The public company, the share price, that's the most visible aspect. But if you look at private investments, it actually is going up, every year. And we're at almost $20 billion invested on the private side in cell and gene therapy, which is astounding. Now, the equation part of it is trickier for companies on a single bet basis, which is people used to say, we're going to create a new platform, a non-viral gene delivery. We're going to create a platform, we're going to start a company, hire 300 people, and we're going to go public. That's not going to work anymore. I think you need to have a product that actually has therapeutic benefit to patients and have a laser focus in developing that product. And that's the way you're going to build a company. Stage one is have a product which you can see all the way through to the end and have the financing to deliver to the end, including CMC, before we start diversifying into lots of platform improvement or lots of different diseases. So being product focused, being prudent on the spend, not every company needs a huge G&A function. Not everybody needs a beautiful building. You can start more prudently. And I think if you do that, you're actually allocating more resources towards the programs. And finally, on capital, I think be very thoughtful about capital formation. Do not rush to become a public company. I think getting more sources of capital as a private company, but also getting more runway than you originally anticipated would be the piece of advice I would have for companies that are starting now in the cell and gene therapy or generally in the regenerative medicine space.
Got it. So I have one last set of questions, just so there's a little bit of opportunity for the audience to ask a couple. So the what's next? What do you think that we'll be talking about at ARM's 2025 Cell and Gene State of the Industry briefing, or even in 5 years? What are the trends? So I'll start with Andrew and finish with Sam.
I want to go a little farther than that because I don't think much will change in 2 years. I think we'll hopefully be at some incremental products, and I think a lot of the time, the industry will have gotten a lot more confidence in the commercialization of these therapies and create a better capital environment for companies. But go out 5, 10 years, I really hope that we're talking about new technologies, more in vivo options, lower cost manufacturing, both because we've had manufacturing innovation, but also because we've developed approaches that are lower cost, and that we're getting gene and cell therapy not only to the US, not only to Europe, but to the rest of the world as well. And we are on that curve that antibodies went on, where at first it was really expensive and it was a few indications. And then nowadays it's a preponderance of clinical development in many cases. And that cell and gene therapy is on that trajectory.
Sam?
Yeah, my prediction for the next 3 years is, one, if some of these launches go well, and that's, always some uncertainty around it, but if my assumption is they're going to go well. If they go well, I think you're going to see pharma jump in a big way in the next 3 years. And that's what's going to provide that second tailwind and turbocharge cell and gene therapies when big pharma says we have to be in this space. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that, maybe not in 24 that quickly, but in the next 2 to 3 years, I do see that becoming a CEO level issue at pharma to say, what is our ability to play in cell and gene therapies?
Thank you. We have some time for audience questions. We have someone here in the front.
Yeah. Hi. I wanted to touch on what Andrew had mentioned here. I come from a payer background, working for a blues plant up in the Seattle area. Thank you. So I'm really interested to hear how this is being spoken about in the J.P. Morgan conference and what the level of understanding is about payers' stances on cell and gene therapies and their value. And Andrew mentioned here that his thought is, that they're paying for this now, and so they're convinced of the value of cell and gene therapies. I can tell from working with payers, employer groups, reinsurers, that honestly they're not convinced of the value necessarily yet, but because there's so few of these therapies on the market, they're looking at it in a big picture and saying, these are basically like meteorite strikes right now when you got a $2.5 million claim that comes in here. At the end of the day, especially if Zolgensma was a perfect example, when we were looking at that and we were running the numbers and we were talking to our large employer groups up there, we're saying none of you are going to get hit by more than maybe 1 or 2 of these claims. It's possible that they'll have the Zolgensma infusion, and yet it's still, they may need to supplement that, and it's turned out that's happened with Zolgensma. They've had to supplement the gene therapy with standard treatments. And so I would say that the takeaway here, from a payer's perspective, is that the payers aren't necessarily convinced that these therapies are effective yet, but because there's so few of them on the market, and that the financial hit is spread out enough right now, you're not seeing reinsurers, you're not going to see employer groups, and you're not going to see first dollar payers taking a hard stance on not covering these, especially if you're dealing with something like sickle cell or like spinal muscular atrophy. So I just wanted to give that point from a payer's perspective, that we're not necessarily convinced of the value, but we don't want to be having that public fight about something that's really not sinking our financial boat. So.
Any questions?
Hey, I'm Steven from Eppendorf Bioprocess. Sam, you mentioned that for a allo CAR T program, a reduction from $60,000 to $13,000 for the cost of goods. Is that like the 4x level of cost reduction that we should expect for lots of these therapies when they go through like real yield improvements and process improvements? And how will we track that and see that?
Well, I think we should aspire for even more. I mean, try to get 10x improvements, right? Because some of these improvements can happen through process improvements, yield improvements, but others are also biologic edits. You can actually make edits to cells to make them more robust or expand more. And then all of a sudden you're seeing a bigger quantum of improvement. And I think All this started because on a trip to India, I realized that they were doing a lot of transplants there for oncology patients, and they can do it pretty efficiently. They can do a transplant for AML for about $10,000 in India, because that's the ability to pay. And so the challenge posed by those clinics to me was, can you get a CAR T in the $10,000 to $20,000 range? That's the way you're going to hit the middle of the pyramid. You're never going to hit the bottom of the pyramid there, but that's the middle of the pyramid. And the same equation for China. And that sparked this notion of how do you get there? And it cannot just be yield improvements through operator training or using the suite more efficiently. It has to be something more biologic and fundamental. And that's what got us to that 4x now, but we want to get to 10x to eventually serve these markets.
Thanks.
I think we have time for a final question.
Hi, I'm Rosanna from Biosystems, and so I've been kind of looking into different variants of Cas technology. So kind of curious about like kind of what's your viewpoint on the next generation of Cas? Like, are people switching from Cas9 to Cas12? Because there was the big payout to like editors for the royalty and the milestone payment, right? So curious if the field is switching to different new variants.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
Well, so I think we should put all this in context. If you look at the late 80s, you had the early recombinant proteins and early antibodies, and then you had humanization, and then you had fully human antibodies. And there's going to be an evolution and improvements to the fundamental technology, and that's the secular tailwind, right? So we are going to see different enzymes or different endonucleases that are developed. There's not going to be, what's surprising to me is 10 years later, after the seminal discovery of CRISPR-Cas9, we still rely on SpyCas9 as the fundamental workhorse, right? I can't tell you how many experiments we've done, how many experiments companies have done to find a different Cas9 that's better. Now, there may be some that are smaller, some that do a specific type of cut, but somehow in nature, over 1 million years of evolution, SpyCas9 has been the best Cas9 out there. And that's what people are using, and that's what people are tethering to. So yes, you'll have more variety, more in the toolkit. But again, my advice to companies is the fundamental value creation is going to be in how you make a product from the toolkit as opposed to the toolkit itself, and use what's best for that indication. If there is a Cas9 that works better, or if there's a endonuclease that works better, or a guide that works better for ALS, use that. It doesn't have to be based on what's most prevalent or whatever else. It's use the best tools for the best effect in that disease.
Great. With that, we'll conclude this session. Thank you all for joining the ARM briefing.